We know people get sober through AA, but what if it's not for you? Does that mean there's no hope, or are there different options? We're going to explore all the different ways that you can get sober without AA. Hello and welcome back to Potentialize Studio. My name is Ashley Fruxiomos and I'm your host for this podcast. This podcast does explore diverse stories of sobriety. And so whether you're sober or sober curious, we explore all those stories and we do get into a bit of the education around sobriety and addiction as well. Today, we're going to enter into a topic that's often discussed but rarely explored in depth, and that's how to get sober without AA. First, I want to say that Alcoholics Anonymous is a lifeline for a lot of people. And so while it does help a lot of people, it's not everyone's path to sobriety. This podcast is really to highlight that it's not the only way. I'm going to go over AA and Alcoholics Anonymous and just describe some of the key aspects of the program just so we can understand what that actually looks like before we go into exploring some of the other ways that you could get sober. So I'm going to read off a bit of a definition. So the key aspects of the program include anonymity. So members are encouraged to maintain confidentiality. There's peer support groups. There's often sponsorship. And so what will happen is that experienced members will support newcomers through their journey. There's also a spiritual approach to overcoming addiction, though it's not affiliated with any specific religion. And so, like I said, while AA has helped men and women, individuals across the world recover and get sober, it's not always the preferred or most effective method for each individual. There are so many different paths you can take. And so in today's episode, I want to explore 8 different things that you could do to get sober outside of AA. These are some of the things that I did and that I've heard from some of my guests and other folks that I've encountered in the sobriety community. And then at the end, we're going to explore 3 things that are mostly cautions or things to probably avoid in your sobriety journey. So the first piece that is really important is self-reflection and commitment. I think both of those pieces are critical in any journey. And while some people will hit what we refer to as a rock bottom, I think those instances really force people to self-reflect because they've had some sort of incident happen in their life. Maybe they've lost their job, they've lost a car. And so they're really forced to then look at their relationship with alcohol and then potentially reconsider that relationship. You might not be in that spot right now, but it never hurts to self-reflect and see if you could change that. Could it be a bit of a problem? For me, I think I went so long drinking without realizing it was a problem because of the fact that everyone else was doing it. It was very much drinking in environments where others were drinking in the same ways that I was. My drinking at the beginning and throughout my teenage years was very much binge drinking on weekends. It wasn't until probably much later when I had gone through a few life things, as it were. I had broke up with my fiance that I had been engaged to for 5 years. COVID hit. We lost a friend in a very traumatic way. I lost my grandmother. Just a lot of things happened at once, and I wasn't able to cope emotionally, and I relied on alcohol to cope, and it progressively got worse to a point where I could not control it anymore. I was drinking every single day, and the amounts in which I was drinking just continued to increase and increase until it got to a point where I remember very clearly. I'll probably never forget this day. I woke up in the morning just feeling so low. I felt a lot of anxiety. I felt like guilt. It felt like there was something sitting on my chest. I just felt so down. And I remember the thought that if this is what life's going to be like, then I don't want to live this life. And that thought in and of itself terrified me so much that I was forced in that moment to reflect on my relationship with alcohol. And I was in low enough of a position where I also was really kind of left with only one opportunity at that point. And there's two paths. One, I can continue doing this and feeling this way, and then I'd probably be in a really bad position. The other path was stop drinking. Like, if I could cut this out, then maybe something would change. And so I committed to, in that moment, that I was going to, for the next 3 months, not drink. I think I had read in a meditation book that that was a good way to create a habit, is to do something for 3 months. And then I committed to not drinking for 3 months and meditating every single day for 3 months. I had never meditated really before. And so I don't know why I added that and why that commitment was brought into this commitment to not drink. But I think I thought that the combination of the two had to change something in my life. And so that day I actually did drink because I just couldn't handle the withdrawal symptoms. And then it wasn't until the next day that I finally had given up alcohol. The 3 months, if you know my story, did turn into a year. And so that was my first year of sobriety. And at that time, I remember that day that I had stopped, I knew of AA because I had watched movies, I had heard about it in podcasts. And so I had gone online to see if there were AA meetings in my area. I quickly realized, because of COVID, everything at that time was virtual. And there was a lot of language on the postings of the AA meeting, which candidly scared me a bit. And so it was like, I think, like, there's open meetings and there's closed meetings, and closed meetings are only if you're really serious. And this was the first time that I had ever thought about quitting alcohol, that I didn't know where I belonged and where I fit in. And it was enough to deter me from actually joining those meetings at that time. And so that day, all I did, and I say all I did, but it ended up being a lifeline for me, was download an app called I Am Sober, which is a day counter app that I then quickly realized also had an entire section for community where you could share and post updates on your journey, read others' updates, react to them, respond to them. And I'll get into in a little bit later how important that was for my sobriety. But that's where it began, downloading that app and counting my days. But I really think the most important part of that the beginning of my journey, again, was self-reflecting, reflecting on my relationship with alcohol, which in some ways I was forced to do, and then making a commitment. You don't have to commit to the rest of your life. That, for me, scared the crap out of me. And so I committed to 3 months. For you, it may be 2 weeks. Do what you're comfortable with. And then when you get to the end of that time frame, then reassess and extend it at that time. But really, a piece of that is self-reflecting and determining what is it that you really need to do here. The second thing I would say is educate yourself. There are a lot of resources on recovery, getting sober. And so there's books, there's podcasts like this one. There's so many different places you can go to access resources, like online forums, etc. And I think that it's really helpful to understand more. Education is power sometimes. And so for me, I didn't actually read any Quit Lit to begin with. I did eventually, and I found it so helpful to understand, like, the impact of alcohol on your brain, on your body. That was all super useful for me. But I think initially I didn't actually want to know any of those things. And so initially I actually read a lot of books on, like, meditation and things like that. That was really helpful because I did end up finding out and was diagnosed with OCD. And so for me, I have a lot of, like, those compulsive thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts constantly going on. And so it was no wonder that eventually, as I got more into the meditation, that it was so, so helpful for me. So I did that. I found a lot of education and inspiration just in hearing other people's stories. So whether that was people from the community, whether I seeked it through the I Am Sober app, or whether I listened to podcasts, hearing how other people navigated certain situations was extremely helpful for me. Not everything someone else does will always apply to you, but I think I was able to kind of listen to their story and then take away what did. The other thing was podcasts, like I mentioned. And so specifically, I actually really found the Rual Podcast very helpful for me. And it's funny because I started listening to his podcast many, many years before I ever got sober. And it wasn't that he necessarily had a podcast about recovery, but that was his journey. He had gotten sober a number of years ago, and he had kind of talked about that in his podcast at that time. He talks about it, I think, a lot more maybe now. But I think when then I was ready, knowing that someone else had done this and someone whom I kind of resonated a lot with, he was really active, so am I. He's, very cognizant of the things that he does in his lifestyle that contribute to his physical, mental wellness. And so I was able to kind of see him and his story, and again, just draw inspiration from that. Plus, he would have expert guests on that would talk about different things, and sometimes, again, recovery, sobriety, and it was just really, really helpful for me. So yeah, I would say educate yourself if you can, tap into various resources. I think that that's a really critical step. The third thing I would say is seeking out professional support. And so that could be therapists, it could be addictions counselors, it could be inpatient care, outpatient care. There's so many options out there. And there's also a lot of accessible programming, and there's programs that you can access that are typically kind of subsidized, and so they may be of no cost to you. I was able to access some of those services. CAMH is based in Toronto, so it's a Center for Mental Health and Addiction, and they were part of my journey. They were so helpful. They gave me access to therapists, psychiatrists, anti-craving medication. So I was able to access a whole world of support through them, group therapy. And so, again, some of these things may work, some of them may not, but I think that getting that professional support, also it's a third party that's unbiased, and so they can hear you out. They'll be able to look at what you're going through in your life experiences and provide a bit of perspective on those things. And so I do think that that's a really critical step in the journey, if you can access those professional support groups. The next thing is peer support groups. And so I think while AA is perhaps the most well-known peer support group worldwide, really, there are other alternatives that you can access. And so I'm going to list some of them off. So there is Smart Recovery. There's Life Ring, Recovery Dharma. I've attended some of those sessions. They're really, really good. Women for Sobriety. These groups offer different philosophies and approaches to recovery while still adding that crucial element of support. Each one is a little bit different. And so, like, Smart Recovery, I find, is a little more pragmatic. There's the Recovery Dharma, which is kind of like this Buddhist philosophy and approach. So, you can find what works for you. If you're a woman and not comfortable joining meetings with males, or you just want women's support, there's Women for Sobriety. So you can kind of find what works best for you. And I would say that these are some of more of structured programs. There's also really informal groups that you can attend. And so just going back to the beginning of my journey, I had downloaded that app, I Am Sober. I had found an entire community on that app, and some of the folks in that community had actually started Zoom meetings. It was still the height of the pandemic, and so again, people couldn't meet in person. And so you would join this, and folks from like all over the world really would be joining this Zoom call, and it was very informal. They would have a topic that they would announce at the onset of the call to facilitate conversation if you so chose to proceed with, following that topic. But you would break out into breakout rooms, and you could use that topic, or you could talk about anything else. You could talk about anything you're going through. Maybe you have an event coming up, you want some advice on how to navigate that, or just understand how someone else might have navigated that in the past. And so some of those informal groups can be just as helpful. I know that they definitely were for me. And so, yeah, I would explore any of those. More and more things are popping up. And so go on Google, you can probably find some more. I would also say if you're interested in those Zooms that I mentioned, they are still happening. If you want to DM me on Instagram, I'm happy to share with you some of that information and the links to those meetings. There's quite a few of them now. I think there's probably about one every day of the week that you could access. The next thing is creating a sober support network. And so it's really important to surround yourself with sober people. I know for a lot of people, and it certainly was the case for me, that a lot of my friends in my friend group drink a lot. Like every single weekend, what we would do is go out, go to a bar, go somewhere, and our entire weekend would be surrounded by alcohol. And so I knew very early on that I couldn't continue doing those things with those people, especially early on. I also very quickly realized that I didn't enjoy those situations. And so a large part of me drinking was just to get through the night, but that's another story. And so there's so many different ways now to connect. Instagram's one way that I've actually connected with a lot of other sober people. And while initially it tends to be a bit of a virtual relationship, I've had a lot of those turn into relationships in real life. And now we go do things together. Sometimes it's something small like a coffee. Other times we're, going out and attending sober events. And that leads me to the next thing is attend sober events. For better, for worse, sobriety is becoming a bit trendy. And so what that means is that there's more and more events that are being set up, and they're meant for sober people. And so I've attended a lot of those. It's a great way to meet people. If let's say going to these events, standing around, speaking with folks and drinking non-alcoholic beverages isn't really your thing. There's also run clubs. And so a friend of mine started something in Toronto called Sober Striders, and they meet every Saturday morning and they go for a run together. So lots of different options there. And I think that as you evolve and grow, you might already have hobbies or discover new ones. And with that, you'll meet other like minded people. And so I think, yeah, it's really important to create a sober networking group of friends. The next thing is you're going to notice, I certainly did, you're going to have a lot more time and energy. And for me, I kind of realized this very early on just because I was told from, my sober support network that this would happen. I also knew that I was going to have to prepare for this because I'm not good at being bored. I always need to be doing things. And so I very early on was aware that I'd have more time and energy and planned for it. And I'll explain what that meant for me. But before I get into that, part of this was also recognizing how to maintain, for me, what I call a good baseline. And so you may be familiar with the acronym HALT. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And so for me, the hungry piece, for example, I needed to get ahead of that. I can get really busy. I'll wake up, do my workout, get into my work on this podcast, and then I'll forget to eat. And hours later, I'll feel irritable, I'll feel anxious, I just feel all of these things. And in the past, that frame of mind and feeling anxious really has led me to strong cravings, and in some cases I have relapsed. And so I know the importance now of checking in on those things. And so I have to schedule these things ahead of time. Whether or not I feel like eating, I wake up, I have my protein drink, I do my workout, and I eat breakfast, whether I like it or not. But I do these things as a preventative measure. Angry piece, not really something that I have an issue with. I can touch on the lonely piece. And so for me, again, I work from home. I can go 2 weeks and not realize that I haven't seen another human being. And then when I realize that, I feel so alone, lonely, I feel down. It really puts me in a dark mood and place. And so, again, it's getting ahead of that. I now schedule coffee dates with friends a week in advance. Maybe I'll plan a movie night with my brother. It doesn't have to be something big, it can be something really small. Sometimes it's just getting out of the house and working from a coffee shop to see other human beings. And so, but again, for me, it's getting ahead of those things. For other people, they leverage halt when they notice a craving or when they are feeling maybe anxious or irritable or any of these things, then they check in with halt and to determine, am I feeling hungry right now? Am I angry? And then dealing with which one of those they might be feeling or all of them. It can be all at once. I've been there. The other thing for me was exercise. That's really, really critical for my mental health, and it doesn't need to be like some big extreme workout. For me, it can just be a little bit of movement. And so if I'm tired or lazy one day, I don't want to work out for 2 hours, then it's 10 minutes of yoga, like just any sort of movement, a walk around the block. Anything like that can really, again, help with that baseline of things. And then I would also say, with my time and energy, a really important piece was being creative. I believe that art in all of its forms is a really good way to translate what is inside of you outside in a way to help you understand those feelings, as an example. So I got really creative. I'm not a journaler by any means. I don't really like journaling. It kind of reminds me of like writing in a diary when I was little. And then there's this weird thing that I'm always writing it thinking, what will my future self think? Which is strange, but I think it happens. I've talked to others that have experienced the same. Anyways, and so for me though, I really enjoy writing. And so what I would do is, going back to the app, is use the I Am Sober app to document my sobriety journey, how I was feeling, what I was overcoming. And I really, really found that helpful. I also tried, like, you name it, I probably tried it. I got into filming, got into photography. I started playing the piano. I was learning through an app at home how to play the piano. So explore all of these things. Some of them will stick, some won't, and that's okay. And again, these don't have to be creative things. I have other people that I kind of got sober with in my sober cohort, if you will. Some of them are authors now, some of them are sobriety coaches. There's one that runs a sobriety support organization out of the US. And so there's so many things that you might discover and start to do. And on the other side, you don't have to do any of those things, but you might find that with your time, you want to use that newfound time and energy to be with your family. And for me, that was what I did for the longest time. The creativity piece came a bit later, but um, for me, spending time with my family and just being present for that and reveling in the fact that, like, they were there around me. I wasn't, seeking my next drink or napping because I had too much to drink. That was really big for me. I have one guest that said it's not about being sober, it's about being present. And that for me really, really resonated with me. Um, I had wrote about recently, and I think I posted this on IS, that sobriety for me is not about achievements. It's not about achieving the next thing now that I am sober, but instead it's about treasuring moments, and it's about being grateful for all that I do have, things that I never saw or noticed when I was actively drinking. The next thing I would say is explore holistic approaches. And so this could be meditation, it could be yoga, just mindfulness practices. There are so many different options out there. And not only will it contribute to your recovery and sobriety, but really your overall health overall. And for me, so meditation, I think I mentioned earlier, was a really big one for me. Being diagnosed with OCD, and knowing now that the number of sheer thoughts going through my head and these obsessive thoughts that are constantly going, meditation really for me was a way that I could be mindful of those thoughts, not erase them completely, but really kind of just like, for me, slow things down, and it created a lot less stress around all of what was going on in my head. Again, when I first started, I absolutely hated it. Like, hated it. I couldn't even do 2 minutes. It was just so painful for me. But like anything, if you practice it, you will get better. It'll go from like very painful to bearable to very helpful. At least that was my experience. The other day I was actually listening to a Rual podcast, and Dr. Judd Brewer had mentioned something which I think is super easy to apply. Anyone really can do it, and it's quick, and it still has the power to make a big difference. And so I think he called it the 5 finger breathing or something like that. So basically, for those of you viewing, you can see my hand, but for those of you that are just tuning in through the podcast, I'll do my best to explain it to you. So you hold up your hand, your 5 fingers, and you could start at, let's say, like the base of your pinky, and you breathe up, going up to the tip of your pinky, and then pause, and then come down on the other side of your pinky and pause, and then come up again on your next. So then, and then you keep on going, and you go through the 5 fingers. And there was some science to just back this up. I think in terms of, the focus, the physical component of it, and then of course the breath. And so there are so many tools out there even now that are free to assist you in this. There's meditations through YouTube that are accessible. Um, and yeah, I think it's just, again, like it's all contributing to an overall probably better baseline, a healthy lifestyle. And not everything, as I said, is going to be easy when you first start off, but it's often well worth it. Okay, number 8, the last one before we get to the 3 kind of cautions. So this last one, 8, is really lifestyle changes. And so, I mean, this could be so many things, but really, I think it's adopting healthier habits, kind of bringing all these pieces together, ensuring that you have a sober support group, sober network of friends. You may find new hobbies and new interests. Just surrounding yourself with these things, I think, can be so important. We know cutting out alcohol is good for our mind and for our body. And so, with that, I think we want to continue to do things that nourish both and contribute to both in positive ways. Sometimes for me, when I could combine like movement and social, that's really where I think things were the greatest and most powerful for me. And so some examples of that is I would join exercise classes. And so I would go do like spinning, boot camp, yoga, different things like that. You would meet like minded people at those groups. And then sometimes it would lead to coffee or lunch together. I will say this isn't naturally I mean, it could naturally happen, but it didn't for me. It takes someone to step up and ask. And that someone was me in almost every case, just because no one else was doing it and I wanted to hang out with people. And so it was really awkward for me at first, I would say. Like, I was not comfortable with just going up to someone in class and be like, hey, next class on Saturday, do you want to go out after and like grab a coffee? But to be honest, I think you'll be surprised how many people do want that type of interaction. And it's so nice to just after a workout session, go grab a tea, go grab a coffee, go get something to eat and connect with, um, like-minded people. I think there's also some of these events that you could tap into. Like I had said, there's run clubs, right? And other folks are sober as well. And then maybe you go grab a I mean, there's so many examples. Um, I think the other one is also like at sober events, just approaching people on Instagram, reaching out to people. Like, don't hesitate to do that. Again, I think it will feel uncomfortable, and that's probably pretty natural. But then you need to face those uncomfortable moments. And that leads me to my next point, which is, and this is kind of a bonus point, that I think it's one thing that is so, so important, but no one talks about. And that is getting out of your comfort zone. Now, I know this podcast has primarily been kind of tools for when you get started, and a lot of these things will apply right throughout your sobriety. Um, but focus it primarily on some of the things that would help you, especially early on, or how to get started, because we were looking for an alternative to AA, and I think AA is often a lot of folks' starting points. And so, for those that aren't comfortable with AA or don't have the interest in attending one of those groups, I wanted some to share some solutions in terms of where you could start off otherwise. But back to the point about getting out of your comfort zone. Sobriety is not about like locking yourself in the house and then never drinking again and feeling fine because I'm not drinking, but then I'm not living either. Like that will inevitably lead you back to drinking because you're going to be so bored. You're going to be craving social connection, all of these things. So, you can use your sobriety as this amazing opportunity to grow, to be the best version of yourself. And it could be little things, it could be big things. I mean, for me, I had never been on a date sober ever in my life. And so when I went on that first sober date, I was like shaking. I was so nervous. But afterwards, honestly, didn't even really matter who it was with because I was so happy that I had overcome something and faced it sober. If you think about the fact that I got sober when I was 30 and I started drinking when I was 15, I drank for half of my entire life, 50% of my entire life. There were a lot of things that I had never done sober. There were a lot of emotions that I had never really confronted sober. And so by the time I was 30, there was a lot of things that I was doing for a first time sober, like going on a sober date. And once you can do these things, I mean, you're going to do them and you're going to be afraid, but you do them anyways. And what you will realize after is not only the sense of accomplishment, but with time, it'll help you build your confidence. And I think the irony of that is so funny because I would drink so often because I needed or I thought I needed to drink in order to feel confident. And the reality was is that that never helped build my confidence. Maybe in that moment, but these moments where I'm facing my fears, I'm getting out of my comfort zone, it has increased my confidence exponentially, and it's a sustainable confidence. It's not the few drinks confidence. It's real confidence. And so, yeah, get out of your comfort zone. Okay, as promised, the 3 cautions. So, the first thing I want to say, don't get overwhelmed by doing too much in sobriety. I'm going to coin the term sobriety burnout. It is very enticing, I would say, to like get sober and want to do all the things, like read all the quit lit, watch all the YouTube videos, listen to all the podcasts. And the problem with this is that this is a notion of like holding on. And when you hold on and you hold on so tight, at some point you're going to get tired and you're going to let go. And that's what sobriety burnout is. So, try the things that you're comfortable with. If it's, reading, picking up a book, listening to a podcast, try all of the things. That was what I did. Keep some, and leave some behind. You don't need to maintain doing all of them. I guarantee, like, I did my first year fully sober. I did a full year, and I was like trying to do all of these things and balance them, and that has a shelf life. It's just not sustainable. You get exhausted, and like then sobriety becomes tiring and not appealing at all. It's what I think was the biggest reason that I relapsed after doing that year sober. I just think this is such an important one. So be aware of sobriety burnout. The next thing is be inspired by stories, but do not compare. You might know the saying, it's a common saying, comparison is the thief of joy. And there's that. And then there's also the fact that you're going to see some people succeeding, they're going to be crushing it in sobriety, accomplishing all of these amazing, great things. And that's great for them. But you have to recognize that you are not seeing someone's full story. Not only are you not seeing someone's full story, but things won't always happen for you in your time. And so just stay with that for a second. Things won't always happen for you in your time. The other thing is, don't compare your beginning to someone else's middle. That's not fair to you. And then the other thing that I used to do is read other people's stories and then use those stories to justify me going back to drinking. And that can be very problematic. You could read anyone's story and be like, oh, I was never that bad. And that's what I did quite a few times. And that can just be so, so harmful. I think what you should do instead is read those stories or listen to those stories or tune into this podcast and look for the things that are similar to yours. You can always find the similarities as well. I think that some people's addictions or substance use issues manifest in different ways. And so for some people that might mean, losing the car, it could mean so many different things, and it might not be the same for you, but don't let that be the reason that you go back. There is a reason why you are here. There is a reason why you showed up in the first place. This is not about comparing. This is an individual journey. Okay, the last final thing, which is our last caution, and we're going to be closing up the episode. Develop internal support. You can rely on a sponsor, you can rely on a therapist to some extent. But at some point, you need to transcend relying on this person. Because then you get into a bit of this willpower game. And also, what's happening is that, like, you're going to have this instance, I've had it with some of my therapists, where I feel this sense of accomplishment going to them and getting praise. Oh, you're doing so well in sobriety. Congratulations. And that can be very, very reinforcing. But what it's reinforcing is that sense of accomplishment. And again, now you're playing this game of willpower. And willpower is not enough to sustain long-term sobriety. Maybe you could do a month. There's a lot of people that do dry January, and that's sheer willpower. That's not what we're looking to do here to maintain long-term sobriety. And so there is a shelf life to this approach. And so I would just say at some point, you need to own this journey for yourself. So remember, there is no one size fits all to sobriety. What works for one person may or may not work for another. And the entire key here is to find out what resonates for you and what supports your journey to recovery, to sobriety, to being sober curious. And so I hope you're able to take some things away from this podcast. It is not by any means exhaustive. There are a ton of additional resources, as I had mentioned, out there where you can access other tools, tips, and tricks. I think The entire reason for me doing this podcast and featuring a lot of stories in the podcast is so that way you can listen to an individual story and their individual journey and potentially get things from their journey that might help you. And so I hope you got something from this. I really, really enjoyed putting this together. Again, if you ever want to reach out, please do not hesitate to do so. Add me on Instagram at Potentialize Studio and feel free to DM me. I'm always happy to connect with whomever wants to reach out and connect with me. I appreciate it. Stay strong. I appreciate you. Take care. That's all for today's episode of Potentialize Studio. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, whether you choose AA or an alternative path to sobriety, what matters is that you are taking steps towards a sober or sober curious life. This is, again, an individual journey. Until next time, take care and stay strong on your sobriety journey.